Hello, and welcome to Your Estate Matters with your hosts, my colleague Greg Brenand and myself, Nicole Garten of Heritage Trust.
Your Estate Matters is a podcast dedicated to everything estates, including building and preserving your legacy.
If it's estate related, we'll be talking about it. We're having the conversations today that will help Canadians protect their families, their assets, and their legacies tomorrow. Kiu, thank you so much for being here to chat with us about business valuation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So maybe we can start. A lot of people might not know, what is a business valuator?
So a chartered business valuator, or CBV for short, is an accredited professional who specializes in determining the value of businesses. Almost entirely private businesses. That's our sort of bread and butter. That's why we get hired. But some of my colleagues will do a lot of work in the public company space. And so to become a CBV, you have to have a university degree. Mm-hmm. Most applicants will have that university degree in finance or accounting. In fact, most CBVs start life as a chartered professional accountant and then choose to specialize later on. So you have to have a university degree. You have to complete a program of studies with the Canadian Institute of Chartered Business Valuators. Takes about 2 years to complete, examinations throughout. Culminates in a sort of massive final common examination that you need to pass. And then on top of that, there's a practicum requirement. I believe it's, last I read, it was 1,500 hours. And yeah, you do those 1,500 hours under the mentorship of a qualified CBV, and you get to use the letters after that.
What are the scenarios where estate business assets need to be professionally valued?
A common one is the death of an individual. There's, I don't know how much you want me, or I need to go into tax law. I'm not the person to do that, but upon the death of an individual, there is what's called a deemed disposition, as I'm sure you're both familiar with. And if the individual owns shares in a private company, they will need to be valued for purposes of that individual's final tax returns. So that's one common reason why someone like me would be retained. Wills Variations Act claims. So if there are some beneficiaries who disagree over how their parents or other relatives' estate was divvied up, and if part of that estate consists of shares of a private company, again, will be asked to get involved. And a more common one that doesn't involve death is for estate planning or tax planning, I should say. If the older generation wants to bring in a younger generation, the family, into the business, it's often done via an estate freeze, where the value of the parents' shares are frozen as at a point in time, and then new shares are issued to a younger generation. And so the value of the parents' or the founders' shares becomes quite important in something like that. So I'd say those are the three common reasons why we're brought into estate matters.
Sure.
So a related question is, why is a proper business valuation so important?
I think there's a couple reasons. Firstly, it reduces, I'm not going to say it eliminates, not by any stretch, but it reduces the likelihood that CRA might challenge the value that's been placed on those shares. I know of, no names obviously, but I know of some clients and or their accountants who think a back of the envelope calculation might be sufficient. And chances are CRA doesn't have the resources to audit every single one of these transactions. Chances are those back of the envelope valuations might go unnoticed, but the ones that do raise a red flag with CRA, they're almost never accepted. And then that just leads into more disputes with CRA and just grief. Whereas if CRA sees that an independent CBV that's not connected to the client or the corporation anyway has prepared a report, again, I'm not going to overstate the case. It doesn't eliminate the possibility of CRA questioning the valuation, but in my experience, it certainly reduces the likelihood that they'll give a forceful challenge to that valuation.
With CBVs, because it's such obviously a broad scope of things they have to look at, do they work in specific segments, Like it's very hard to value one company in an industry and then go to another different company that does quite different, uh, different family structure, different assets in it. We might have construction equipment. Another one might be in wood products.
Yeah.
Like, do you find that you specialize in a certain area?
So that's a really good question. I know my colleagues in industry do have specialties. They will work in different industries, and the ones who work in private practice typically work for much larger entities that can justify having their own, say, investment division or their own acquisition division. Like we're talking larger public companies that will go and buy smaller businesses. They may employ CBVs on their staff in their finance and accounting department to, run the analysis of, hey, how much should we be paying for this target company? Are we overpaying? What's the range that we can offer? So they'll specialize, just like any other professional in industry. They may specialize in engineering and professional services. They may specialize in manufacturing, hospitality, that sort of thing. What I do, which is public practice, and specifically I and my colleagues at my firm, we offer what's called litigation support services. So clients will come to us when they're involved in some sort of dispute resolution process, whether it's litigation or whether it's alternative dispute resolution like arbitration or what have you. No matter the course of their dispute resolution, they need an independent voice. They need someone coming in with an objective viewpoint to assist them in resolving the dispute that they're having. And so in my world, while I would love to say I'm a specialist in A, B, C, D, and E industries, you really are a generalist. And that makes the job kind of fun because even after doing this for 17 years, there's all sorts of industries that I'm not familiar with, but I get to become familiar with in a pretty short period of time. Speaking to management, speaking to industry contacts, doing independent research, both online and through private databases. You sometimes have to learn a lot in a very short period of time. And that's what keeps the job fresh, at least from my perspective, keeps it interesting.
So we've worked together and even in private practice, there are things like, if I recall, you don't like to do tech startups. Is that right?
That is very correct. There are some companies that I just won't touch. And one of them are very early stage tech startups or any early stage companies that don't have a sort of track record of revenues. I'm not even talking profits, but like when you're even pre-revenue, you haven't even finalized the product. You don't know what your markets are like. You don't know what your distribution channels are like. It's just an idea, or it's an idea plus a couple years of, attempted implementation. Yeah, I just try to stay away from those, particularly in the litigation space where people are making some very important decisions based on the conclusion that you're providing. What I typically will do in those situations, and Nicole will be familiar with this in the matrimonial space, is I often recommend doing what's called an in specie division. So rather than have me attempt to value this, which is extremely challenging, and I can provide very little assurance versus other companies. Like I value a lot of engineering companies and architectural companies. If I have a specialty, I would say it's engineering and architecture. And I can tell you without any ego or arrogance, I can probably conclude within 5 to 10% of what that company will probably sell for. Early stage companies, truthfully, I don't know. It could be zero. It could be the next Amazon. It could be worth millions in a short period of time. It's very difficult to tell. So what I tell clients in those situations is, rather than having someone like me attempt to value it, just split the shares in half or some proportion. If things work out, congratulations. You're both going to be stinking rich. If it doesn't work out, well, then you've both suffered equally. And in many cases, in my experience, clients will take that approach. When you tell them, look, there's certain companies I can value within a narrow band, and you can be relatively assured that I'm confident. And then there are much, much wider ranges, and I have no idea what number in that range is better than the other. So sometimes they'll take the shares in their form rather than an equivalent dollar value.
But maybe the entrepreneur doesn't want to be a co-owner with their estranged spouse. So that doesn't always work in practice, but
it's true. But there are creative solutions. Like you could have the spouse who's not involved in the business, not surrender their shares, but have the business owner keep their shares in trust for them. So the business owner still maintains operational control, strategic decisions. It's just the spouse becomes the beneficiary if that comes to fruition. And I get that there's going to be problems too. Like why would a spouse continue to work hard and take these risks if there's a passive investor off to the side? But generally speaking, I feel some of those arguments just require a bit of creative thinking and outside the box solutions. But no, you're right. There are some situations where a division like that just isn't practical. Usually comes down to personalities more than anything else.
Isn't there a chartered business valuator in this town that just does pubs? I seem to recall that.
Is there? I haven't met them. They're very well maybe. It's a pretty small community, but I can't say I know every single CVV in the city. Pubs are a whole different animal altogether, just given the complexity of the alcohol laws in this province. When I am faced with valuing either a pub or a liquor store, there is an industry contact I have. She's absolutely wonderful. She's so on top of her game. She knows everything to do with the licensing regime, not just for alcohol, but for cannabis as well. She doesn't like to testify in court, so she stays more in the deals sector, but she's such a wealth of information. And as an independent expert, as an expert who's asked to testify at court, I'm not a lawyer. Nicole, you can please chime in, but I have certain abilities to go beyond my own personal knowledge base and gain or glean knowledge from experts. And I mean, my opinion is still my opinion. I know I have to testify to my opinion, but I am able to use some hearsay evidence based on industry contacts. Is that
that's
generally correct?
So we're speaking to a lay audience. So hearsay is when you're giving evidence in court that isn't direct evidence. So you're saying, "Oh, I heard this from someone else." And in fact, any kind of documentary evidence is also strangely hearsay evidence. But we won't get into the rules of evidence.
No,
I guess that's
fair.
going to get us down a rabbit hole. But I know a lot of people are concerned about how long is a business valuation going to take and what does it cost? And I know that's often one of the first things you get asked. What do you say to people?
Probably what you tell them when they ask you how much is a divorce going to cost and how long is it going to take. The answer is it depends. And it really does. I'm not trying to be cute or glib, but there are so many factors, particularly in the litigation space, that are outside of a CVV's control, that it really does depend on things like how quickly will the parties or their professional advisors, like their accountants or lawyers, give us the information that we need. Like we have a lot of information requests with these valuations, and it's not just documents. It goes well beyond documents. So how quickly can you turn around that information? How accurate is that information? Does it actually answer the question we asked? Or as some clients like to do they go off on tangents? Do they digress? Do they not actually get to the core of the matter? And so that requires us to continually follow up to try and get the information we need. Other factors like the cooperation between the parties. I mean, the fact of the matter is someone like me gets called in because there's been a breakdown in trust. And they don't trust what the other person has to say. So they're looking to us to validate or verify this information that they've been presented with. And so I find in the highly, the ones that are more highly acrimonious, it takes longer. The communications from the lawyers and the clients are, colorful. I'll use that term. And so it just takes a while to wade through that, which isn't particularly germane to the type of analysis that we're trying to do. And not just cooperation between the parties, but I'm just going to go ahead and say cooperation between legal counsel for the parties is also a big thing. You can see lawyers that get along very well. They're fierce advocates for their clients, but they understand the process. They understand that getting into personal fights is not going to do anyone any good. And then Others don't quite take that approach, and that impacts our work. To answer your question, if I took sort of the vast majority of our files, I'd say if we're dealing with an operating business that's reasonably profitable, has a sustained track record of profitability, and is therefore sort of relatively straightforward to value, our fees can be anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 plus, depending on the nature and complexity of the operations. And in terms of timeline, again, if everything goes really well and we get quick responses and everyone's cooperating, maybe as little as 4 weeks. I mean, I've done valuations in 2 weeks, but it's been the exception, not the norm. Typically, it could take, if all goes well, 4 to 8 weeks. And at the same time, this is no exaggeration whatsoever, I've got about 4 or 5 files right now that are going into year 3 or year 4. And I told them, yeah, we might be done in 8 weeks. And we're now in year 4, not through any fault of the CVVs involved, just all those factors I mentioned. Some I don't know, some clients just love to fight. That's what it comes down to.
Well, what happens if there's a disagreement about the results of the business valuation?
I usually take that as a good sign. Clients will often ask me, how do you know if you got the value right? I said, well, and they think I'm joking, but I'm not. In all seriousness, I say that, well, if at the end of the process, neither one of you is happy with the outcome, then I typically sleep just fine at night. Usually means my conclusion is in the ballpark. Look, clients are not going to be pleased at the end of the process, because they each will go into this with their own thoughts about what the business is worth, their own biases. They may have been told, even by their partner, they may have even been told years ago that the business is worth millions. That's when the relationship was on positive terms, and perhaps the spouse was trying to tell them, look, what a great job I'm doing. But the reality is some of those companies were never worth what the spouse had heard. So yeah, if both parties feel heard and feel like their concerns were addressed, if they're still unhappy, that's part of the job. That's something you get accustomed to very quickly. What bothers me, and what I try to be on the lookout for, and what I try to avoid at all costs, is if a client feels like their concerns have not been heard. If they feel like my information gathering process was entirely one-sided and they didn't have an opportunity to comment. Fortunately, that hasn't happened very often in my career, but it has happened once or twice where the client felt like they just weren't involved. And those are the ones that kind of stick with you. Those I consider to be failures on my part. But if they have been given every opportunity to be involved and to give their comments and to answer the questions, and if they're still unhappy, well, that's part of being an independent expert. I'm not here to make people happy. I'm here to help them resolve issues.
Right.
So this is a little off the beaten track, but a lot of the conversation we're having is often in the context of disputed matters, often marital breakups. But in an estate context, our clients are often thinking about succession and maximizing value for generation 2 or 3, or even an effective sale. Like, do you have any thoughts about, in terms of valuing businesses, what their success? Do you look at their succession planning at all, or does that factor in, or are you just basically looking at financial statements and what their underlying real estate is worth?
No, I think it definitely goes beyond the documents. We would look in terms of your specific question, like how much does the succession plan factor into it? I mean, one of the most important factors we look at when valuing a business, one of the key determinants, is the quality and depth of management. The most important question I'll ever ask a business owner when I'm trying to value their business is, what happens to you if you get hit by a bus on the way home tonight? And it's a morbid question, and no one likes to think about it, but it is arguably the most important question I'll ask, is what happens to this company if you're no longer there? Tell me what happens not right away, because I think any company, if they lost their founder or key executive, would probably have a period of, at least several weeks, if not several months, where people are running around not sure what to do. But talk to me 6 months from now. 6 months from now, is there someone or a group of people that are able to step in and take over and keep operations running smoothly? Or is this company going to cease to exist in 6 months. And I find business owners who are willing to engage in that conversation, and that's where you really find out whether or not this business has any enduring value, any goodwill value. So in terms of succession planning, absolutely. If we're valuing this business for an estate plan and the founder is wanting to step back, that's the whole purpose. We're absolutely going to have conversations around, okay, who's your successor? And then speak to that successor and, gauge what their experience is in this particular business or in this particular industry. And often if it's a family-run business, they will have had, many years of exposure and have worked their way up through the ranks. And I can't recall of any instance where, I found, I'm sure there's been a couple, but I can't recall any specific instances where someone who hasn't been learning from the first the older generation who hasn't been involved in the business came across as a complete incompetent buffoon. Like that, that's been very rare. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's definitely something we look at.
That really does answer the question. So I'm just going to ask you a follow-up question, and I apologize, Kiu, because I know we're going off like pure valuation, but
that's all right.
In a business succession context, there's something called the 3-circle model. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's the family circle, the business circle, and the ownership circle. So in terms of a business, we're looking at who's considered inside the family, who's considered inside the business, and who's considered inside the ownership circle. So what I'm hearing from you is as a focus on the business circle, i.e., is there a succession in respective management? But probably you also look at ownership succession, i.e., shareholder agreements, shotgun clauses, things like that. Can you speak to that and how that factors into a valuation context?
I mean, specifically with a shareholders agreement, one of the first documents we'll ask for is a shareholders agreement because sometimes, fortunately not often, but sometimes a shareholders agreement will include how the valuation should be conducted. In fact, some go as far as to actually include a valuation formula. I hate formulas because it forgets the fact that so much of a valuation is subjective and subject to professional judgment. Formulas don't lend themselves well to that. But something as black and white as there may be a formula in the shareholders agreement that says how you go about valuing it. We would look to the shareholders agreement for guidance on that. We may not agree with the formula. We rarely do, but that's a legal document. That's how the family or the shareholders have decided to conduct their business. And so they just need someone to essentially come in and do the math for them as an independent professional. Beyond the potential for valuation formula, there are shotgun clauses, as you mentioned. For your audience, shotgun clause is where if it's a clause in the shareholders agreement where if you have more than one shareholder, either shareholder can instigate this procedure where they throw out a number. And once they throw out that number, it becomes a mandatory offer. And the offer is either you sell me your shares at this price, or you insist that I sell you my shares at that same price. And the purpose of a shotgun clause is it tries to ensure fairness. It tries to ensure that both parties have given some substantive thought and consideration to what they genuinely think this business is worth. And so when that number is thrown out by either party, there's a serious decision that needs to be made. And I will, and my colleagues for that matter, will get called into those situations where we're not working for the company, but we're working for one of the shareholders in advance of them throwing that number out. They want to know what a range of reasonable values would be because they don't want to try to lowball the other side. Because you got to remember, if they're the one throwing out the number and they lowball it, the other side can insist that you sell to them. And similarly, you don't want to go too high because if you go too high, the other side will be like, great, we're going to sell to you at that price. And there are some business owners who are extremely, extremely capable, extremely intelligent, and very adept at running their business, but they never stop to ask themselves, what is this worth? And oftentimes the first time they need to address that question is because they're either considering the shotgun clause or they've been told that their partner of, in many cases, many years now wants out.
So in terms of ownership succession, you'll often look at a shareholders agreement is what I'm hearing. And so it could be on death or not getting along or disability or divorce or bankruptcy, or do you, or just one of the parties just decides they want to retire, or what do you see?
All of those.
All of those.
All of those. In fact, I'll tell you the most common thing we see is no shareholders agreement.
Mm-hmm.
That's still the most common situation is there's no shareholders agreement. So there's no shotgun clause. There's no protocol that's been established in terms of what do we do in these situations. And that, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a corporate lawyer. I'm not a lawyer of any sort. I'm not a trust practitioner, but based on what I've seen, and I'm sure you've probably given clients the same advice, if you own a business with other people, whether they're family or not, have a shareholders agreement.
What are some of the most interesting types of businesses you've valued?
So I was giving that some thought before I came here, and one sticks out. It was one I did several years ago, and it was an online marketer and distributor of all natural health products.
Mm-hmm.
So what they sell doesn't have to pass muster with FDA or Health Canada. It's all natural ingredients. And their biggest seller was a little blue pill that was for male erectile dysfunction. They had other products, but that was their biggest seller. And did a little bit of research, as we often have to do in these situations, and no scientific data whatsoever to back up this company's claims of effectiveness. None, no link. And yet, this is a company of 3 individuals in our very own backyard. Not going to mention the name, obviously, or the name of the company or their names, but 3 people, and they've built this online website. They don't do any of they don't do any of the manufacturing. They contract the manufacturing out to a third-party manufacturer. A lot of their formulations are subcontracted out to a bunch of PhDs and scientists, thankfully. What they specialize in is creating a market, doing the marketing plan, working with all of these parties. And they don't even ship. They don't even have warehouses. They drop ship the products directly from the manufacturer to the client. And this was a business that generated $30 million US a year in revenues. And then their profit before tax was a little over 10 million. So their margins were insane. Their growth was just unbelievable. And it's just all based on, I don't know what you would call it. Fake news, fake products that at the very least have no sort of scientific basis, yet people are just throwing money at them left, right, and center. It was very eye-opening that, there's that segment that, based on a colorful pill and some really good marketing points will just give them that kind of money. But you know what sticks with me is not so much what I think the public might consider interesting. It's the boring businesses that actually stick in my mind. I valued a plumbing distributor, and I had to value their business as at 2 dates: a current date and a historical date about 15 years prior to the current date. And there's legal reasons as to why the 2 valuation dates were required. But my point is, I looked at essentially 15 years worth of sales and profit data for this company. So again, it was a plumbing distributor. And what I noticed was the steadiest business that I had ever seen in my career. The global economic meltdown of 2007, 2008. Nope, their revenues were nice and steady. The COVID pandemic, revenues nice and steady. They never had a blip. It was just consistent growth year after year after year. And I was talking to the business owner. I said, I got to tell you, I've been doing this for 17 years and I've never seen a business like yours that has never had a hiccup, that has never done anything other than grow consistently and generate steady profit margins. I'm like, what is the secret? And he just goes, there's no secret. People have to poop. That was it. That was his sort of nugget, was people have to poop. And I'll never forget that. Until the day I die, I will never forget that. That those are the unsexy, seemingly uninteresting businesses that operate in this province, and they make collectively a lot of money.
Yes.
And you've never heard of them, but they look after their clients very well. They stay on top of their financials. They stay on top of their numbers. They hire well. They treat their people well. And yeah, it's not, like I said, they're not the sexiest businesses. They're not crypto. They're not tech, but boy, they're well managed. They make a lot of money, and they're necessary. They're absolutely necessary industries. So those are the ones I tend to remember.
Well, Kiu, thank you so much. How can people find you if they've got more questions?
Oh, so my firm is called Blair, Mackay, Mynett Valuations, or BMM Valuations for short. If they need any valuation assistance, my colleagues and I are always happy to have a chat. Even if it doesn't lead to anything, always happy to have a chat, answer any questions your listeners might have. Easiest way to find me and my colleagues would be just Googling BMM Valuations in Vancouver, and our website's pretty easy to find. And contact information is there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This has been fun. Thank you.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered individual legal, financial, or tax advice. Make sure to consult the advisor of your choice to advise you on your own circumstances. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your Estate Matters. If you like this podcast, make sure to follow it on your podcast platform of choice.
Whether you are planning your own estate or you're acting as executor for somebody else's, Heritage Trust can help. Partner with Heritage Trust to protect your family, your assets, and your legacy.
If you would like more information about Heritage Trust, please visit our website at heritagetrustcompany.ca.
This podcast is produced by Podfather Creative.